Alright guys, so now we're going to jump in and get started with CSS Grid, which is one of the best additions to CSS and makes grid-based layouts very easy to create. So what is the grid? It's a grid layout system for CSS. It's similar to Flexbox in that you can do a lot of the same things that you can do at Flexbox. However, there are some big differences. The biggest being that the grid is capable of two-dimensional layouts, and I'll get to that in a minute. CSS Grid is a bit harder to use than Flex, but it's also more powerful. And we can still use the same alignment properties that we've used with Flex, such as align items, justify content. As far as browser support, all browsers support it aside from Internet Explorer, which does have partial support for the grid system. Now, since you've already learned Flexbox, if you've been following along with this course, that's going to help you tremendously because you understand the concept of having a container and then having items within that container. And grid works the same way where you set a display property to grid of a container, and then all of the child elements become grid items. And then we can set a property called grid template columns where we define the number of columns that we want as well as the widths. And you're going to be introduced to a new unit of measure called FR, or fraction. Now, the biggest difference between Flex and the grid is that Flex is not capable of two-dimensional layouts. You use it for a single row or column and you just set your alignments. With the grid, you can have two-dimensional layouts. So on the left, we have just a one-dimensional row with a nav bar, and this is something we would use Flexbox for. You could use the grid, but Flex is usually good for this type of stuff. And then on the right, we have basically an entire layout that is set with one grid, okay? And you can actually span items across multiple columns and multiple rows. And this is a good example of exactly what I'm talking about. This is one grid, and this is something we cannot do with Flexbox. You see, it's two-dimensional. It goes both ways. We can take an item and we can span it down separate rows, or we can take an item and we can span it across columns, or we can span it across both rows and columns. Where Flexbox, you would just have just elements along in one row, one line, and it's just one dimensional. So that's the biggest difference. And there's different use cases for each. I can't stand the argument of always use CSS Grid. In my opinion, people that say that, they're just the type of people that have to use the newest thing and have to use buzzwords just to basically sound smart and sound cool. And that's just ridiculous. There's different use cases for Grid and Flex. For me, I like to use CSS Grid for outer elements, basically boxes and grid-like layouts. And then for simple alignments or inner elements, things like menu items, stuff like that, I use Flex for. Most of the stuff that we've done up to this point, like menu items and landing pages where we're centering elements in a Flex column, I would use Flex for that. I would not use the grid for that. There were a couple cases, like maybe with the hotel site where we had the different boxes. I may have used the grid for that. But it's preference. Everyone's different. Some people will use only one or the other, but those people generally don't understand the difference and the use cases. So you'll kind of pick this stuff up as you go along. All right, guys, so we're going to jump into CSS Grid here. Now, I've created a whole new folder called CSS Grid Sandbox, and I'm going to create a new file called 01_grid_columns.html, and we're going to go over just the basics of how the grid works, also the grid template columns property. So I'm going to close the sidebar up and we'll generate our boilerplate here. Let's say grid columns and style. And the fact that you know Flexbox, if you've been following along with the course, is going to benefit you because the grid works in a similar way where we take a parent element and we set display grid just like we would do display flex, and it makes all the child elements of that parent, it makes them grid items, and then we can add specific properties on the parent to affect the grid items. So let's go ahead and create our markup. I'm just going to do a class of grid. This is going to be the container. Okay, and it doesn't matter what you call the class, obviously. I just called it grid. And then let's do a few divs with the class of item. So we'll just, for the content, we'll say item and then an incrementing number, and we'll do ×3. Okay, so we have 3 div elements inside of our container here. So let's style the items first of all, just so we can kind of get a better visual picture of how this works. So I'm going to add, let's say padding, we'll do 3 rem, and let's do a border, 1 pixel solid, and a background of light gray. And let's do a font size of 1.3 rem. We'll do font weight bold, and let's do text align center. All right, so I'm going to save this, and we'll go ahead and open this up with live server, and we just have our 3 items here. So what we need to do now is add, for this parent right here, this div, we want to add display grid. So I'm going to say the class of grid, we want to do display and then grid. Okay, now if I save that, nothing happens. It's not like flex where it automatically turns into a flex row. What we need to do is add another property called grid template columns. So let's say grid dash template dash columns, and here is where we specify how many columns we want and also the width of those columns. Okay, so basically by columns I mean, you know, we'll have 1 column, another column, so basically going in a horizontal row. So let's say we want to do 3 columns that are 200 pixels wide, so 200 pixels for the first, second, and third, and if I save that, that's exactly what we get. Okay, so no floats or anything like that. We simply create the number of columns we want and the width. Now, even if we have more than 3 grid items here, that's absolutely fine. It's just going to continue on to the next line. So if I were to copy this down and say 4 and save, it's just going to go right into the next spot. Okay, if we do 2 more and we say 5, 6, and save, it's just gonna keep going in this sequence. All right, so this is great for like news sites, which is what one of the projects that we're gonna build. It's great for image galleries, and it's just great for just basic layout. It's just if you want just a main area with a sidebar, you simply set 2 columns. All right, now this obviously doesn't go all the way across its container, which is container is the viewport. But let's say we wanted the middle one to stretch so that this went all the way across. We could use auto. So if I put in auto here and I save, now it's going to give it the length that it needs to fill the container. And if I stretch it out, it's always going to fill its container. Okay. And let's say I wanted them all to be the same, but I wanted them to fill the container. I could do this. Let me just copy this down. I'll comment this out. And instead of doing the 200 pixels, let's do auto. Let's do it 3 times. Okay, so now we have 3 columns that are all the same size. If we wanted 4, we could add in another one like that. Now, there's a better way to do this. If you're going to be repeating the same width like this, you can simply use repeat, and then this takes in 2 things. It takes in the number of times you want to repeat, which I'm going to say 3, and then the width you want to repeat, which I'll do auto, and save, and you see we get the same result. If I were to put, let's say, 200 pixels in here and save, it's going to repeat 200 pixels 3 times. So this is a much nicer way to do it. Now, we used pixels here. You can also use other units. You can use percentages, but the most common unit you're going to see when using the grid is an FR unit, which is a fraction. So it's basically a fraction of the page, and it works similar to how the flex property works. When we say flex 1, flex 2, you know, it works similar to that. So I'm going to copy this down and comment that out. I just want you guys to have this as a reference. But we can do let's say 1 FR for the first row, 2 FR for the second, and 1 FR for the third. And we'll save, and you can see that it's split up into fractions, and the second one is larger. And if I wanted it even larger, I could do 3 FR, and it will extend more. Okay? If I wanted to do 2 and then maybe 2 on the end, so we'll have 1 short and then 2 longer ones, we could do that. We could do any combination we want. And of course, we can do repeat with FR as well. And that's usually what I would do, is repeat 3, 1 FR if I wanted 3 columns that were all the same width. Now, notice that these are all stuck together, right? So instead of adding margin, there's actually a specific property we can use called grid gap. Okay, so we're going to say grid gap, and you can put any unit here, pixels, whatever. I'm just going to do 1 rem and save, and it's automatically going to add that gap, that spacing in between. All right, and there's no dealing with, you know, calculating widths or anything like that. It just simply works, and it doesn't matter how wide or narrow the browser is either. All right, so that's pretty much the basics of how to create a grid and create basically like a horizontal row with columns. What I want to show you now is just how easy it is to do a simple layout, like a main area and a sidebar. If you remember back to when we did the floats, where we had to carefully choose the percentages, we had to clear them, stuff like that. So I just want to show you how simple it is. If we had, let's say, main, and inside main, we want our main area or content area to be a section, and we'll just put an H3. Say welcome to my site. We'll do a paragraph and say lorem 30, and let's say we want an aside, so this would be our sidebar. We'll just say whatever, hello, and let's say lorem 10. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and we want this to be our sidebar, so we want this to be over here. So with the grid, we could take this main, because that's the parent of the section and the aside, and we could simply say display grid, and we'll define our grid template columns, and we'll simply do 2 FR for the main area or for the section, and then 1 FR for the aside, for the sidebar. And then let's give it a grid gap of, let's say, 1.5 rem, and save, and that's it. Okay, so 3 lines instead of having to float and deal with percentages. It's very, very simple. If we wanted to have it split in the middle, we could do 1 FR, 1 FR, like that. Okay, if we wanted this to be a little bigger, we could do 3 FR. So it's very simple to manipulate how your content is displayed and how things are aligned. All right, so in the next video, we're going to start to look at grid rows, because up to this point, we've looked at grid template columns, but there's also a grid template rows. So that's what we're going to get into next. All right, so in the last video, we looked at how to create a grid and how to deal with the grid template columns property. Now, there's also a grid template rows property, and we're gonna look at that. We're also going to talk about the implicit grid or implicit rows. So let's create a new file here called 02_grid_rows.html. And I'm going to actually copy what we have in the grid columns file, because there's going to be some things that are similar. So we'll paste that in, and we'll change the title here. And let's get rid of everything in this grid class except for display grid. I want to keep the item styling. Get rid of main. We don't want that. We don't want this main down here. I just wanted to show you how easy it was to create a basic, you know, main area and sidebar. But we're going to keep this here, and let's open this with Live Server. All right, so remember with Flexbox, we have a row and a column. Okay, we can set flex direction to either row or column. With the grid, we also have rows and columns. So I'm going to go ahead and set grid-template rows, and let's set this to, we'll do 1 FR, 2 FR, 3 FR. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and let's see what we get here. So as you can see, they're vertical, okay, so it's not, we're not adding columns here, so it's not going horizontally. And the first one is 1FR, second is 2FR, third is 3FR. Okay, if I were to add another one here and go 4FR, the next one will be 4FR, but notice the ones that are remaining where we don't add a specific value for, they're just going to stay the same. They're all going to look like this. This is actually called the implicit grid or implicit rows because we didn't manually set them. In fact, I'm going to take this one off, and there's actually another property we can use if we want to set these to something different, and that's grid auto rows. Okay, so if we say grid dash auto dash rows, we can set this to, let's say we want the rest of them to be 3FR as well, just like the last one that we put here. So we can say 3FR and save, and now the rest of them are all 3FR. All right, now unlike Flexbox, the grid is multi-dimensional, so we can use grid template rows along with grid template columns. So just to show you that, let's say grid dash template dash columns, and let's say we want to do let's do repeat. We'll just have 2, so we'll say repeat 2, and let's do 1FR. What did I spell wrong here? Oops. Okay, so we'll save that, and now you can see that we have our columns, which is just 2, 1FR, so the columns are even. But then we also have our rows, which are 1FR, 2FR, and 3FR. And this will still be in effect. So if I were to add extras down here and save, you'll see that those will all be 3FR. All right, and if I wanted 3 rows or 3 columns, I could do that as well. So you can really create the layout that you want, and you can span items across multiple rows and columns, and I'm going to show you how to do that as well. All right, but that is grid template rows. So that's it. I'll see you in the next video. All right, guys, so now I'm going to show you how to take a grid item and span it across multiple rows and columns. So we're going to create a new file here called 03_grid_span.html, and let's go ahead and generate our HTML head body tags. We'll say grid span and style. And as far as the markup, let's just do our parent, call it grid, and then let's do class item. Just say item money sign, and let's do a bunch of them. So we'll do times 15. So we have 15 grid items here. So let's say grid and display grid, and then I'm going to add grid template columns, and I'm going to just do a repeat of 4 1FR items. Okay, so we'll save that. Let's open it up. All right, it's going to look like that. I'm just going to grab the styling of the item from one of the other files, just so we can clearly see them as boxes. Why is this not copying? All right, so I'll save that. Good. Now, what I want to do is take one of these items. We'll take the first one, and I want to show you how we can span it across, okay, across the columns and also down through the rows. So I want to take this item 1 and I want to have it go like this, fill up this whole area and basically push the rest over. So we can do that using, I'm going to show you the kind of the long way first, and then I'll show you a shorter way. So let's first target this first item. We could give it a special class, but well, let's just use our pseudo selectors. We'll use first child, so I'll say class of item. We want the first child, and we have a property called grid column start. Okay, so we can specify where we want it to start in terms of the column. So it starts at 1 right now. Let's just put it to 2 and save, and you can see that it gets pushed over. Okay, so we can start it wherever we want, but I'm going to start it at 1, and then I'm going to use another property called grid column end, and we can basically tell it where we want it to end. And I'm going to put in here 4, and you can see what happens is it spanned across what looks like 3, but what you're going to do is you're going to look at the lines. Okay, so you have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so if you use this grid column and start and end, that's what you're going to look at, is you're going to count these lines. Now, we can also go down, and that's the big difference between the grid and Flexbox, or one of them is that you can't do that with Flexbox. You have your rows, and that's it. With the grid, we can be multi-dimensional, and we can span this down into the next one. So let's add grid dash row dash start, and we'll start at 1, which is where we currently are, and then let's say grid dash row dash end, and let's say we want to end at 3, and I'm going to save that, and now you can see that this is now spanning basically what looks like 2 rows, but again, if you look at the lines, it's going from 1, 2, 3. Now, this is kind of the long way to do this. There's a shorter way, much like with many things in CSS. So I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to show you how to do the same thing by using the grid column and the grid row property rather than start and end. So let's say grid dash column. So it's basically just a shortcut. And we're going to say start at 1, and then we want to do a slash, and we want to span 3. So I save that, you can see it's doing the same thing that these 2 lines are doing. And even though I put 4 here, when I put 3 it does the same thing, because here we're saying we want an item to start at 1 and go to 4, when here we're saying we're taking item 1 and spanning it 3. Okay, and item 1 is here, so we're spanning it 3. Now, if we want to go down like we did before, down a row, we can do grid row. And let's start at 1, and we want to span 2. And we'll save, and we get the same result. Okay, so this is just a shorter way of doing this. Let's grab another one. So let's get a random one. We'll just take 9. So we'll use nth child. So we'll say item, and let's say nth child, and we'll do 9. And I want to keep it in its place, but span it across all the way to the end here. So in terms of columns, it's in the second column, right? So we want to do grid dash column, and we want to set 2. We want to start at 2, and then we want to span 2. Okay, we'll go ahead and save that. Actually, I want it to go all the way over, so we want to span 3. All right, and then if we want to span it down, we could do grid row, and let's start at, so we're at 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's say start at 4, and let's span 2 and save, and now it gets pushed down. Okay, so I mean, you can start it wherever you want. Like we could do grid row 2 and span 2, and it's gonna get pushed up here. All right, and notice that it's completely out of order, but you may want that. You may want your markup to be a certain way, but you want to move the element visually without changing your markup. So the grid is good for that as well. All right, so in the next video we're going to take a look at auto fitting and min-max. Alright, so in this video we're going to look at autofit and min-max, which can make your grid kind of responsive. And it's good in certain situations, not so good in some other situations. It's great for like image galleries, stuff like that, but probably not so much for just regular website layout. So I'm going to create a new file here called 04_minmax.html, and let's generate our HTML here. Okay, and I'm just going to copy the styling for the item. and paste that in here. And then in the body, let's put our parent, and then we'll do item, and let's do times 4. Okay, so we have 4 grid items, so let's set display grid onto our parent element here. And then we're going to set grid template columns, and I want to set it to repeat, and I want to set in here auto fit, so auto dash fit, and then instead of just setting a width here, I'm going to use min max, which is a minimum and a maximum, so it's going to take in those two things. I'm going to say a minimum of 300 pixels, a maximum of 1 FR, which is just the whole fraction. So let's save this and let's open this up. Okay, so immediately you can see that there's, at this browser size, we have 2 columns, right? But as soon as I get to 300 pixels, which is our minimum, it's going to just go to, they're going to stack. So it's pretty responsive, and if I go bigger, you'll see we'll have 3 until they hit 300, goes to 2, bigger. Now if we were to make this, let's do like 200, and let's add in a bunch of items here and save. So now you can see that it's pretty responsive. It stacks here, but it's only good for certain types of content, in my opinion. I don't use it for regular layout, because if I wanted to have, like, let's say I just wanted 3 boxes, right, where we have an icon, some text, it's like the features or whatever for the website. I don't ever want it to be like that, you know, so I like to have more control over it in media queries, so that I can set it to be either 3 or stacked like that. I don't want this midpoint here. So I mean, it's good for some things, but not so good for others. Image galleries, things like that, it's really good for. But I did want to just show you that. But in the next video, before we get to, I'm going to show you how to use media queries with the grid as well. But before we get to that, I want to show you something called grid template areas, which are really nice. They allow you to basically map out your content visually within your CSS. And I'll show you what I mean in the next video. Alright, so now we're going to get into a property called grid template areas, which basically allows us to visually map out the alignment of our elements through CSS. So let's create a new file here called 05_grid_, we'll just call it grid areas.html. Alright, so I'm going to close that up, and I'm going to paste in the body here and just go over it because it's kind of a lot. I don't feel like typing it out. But basically we have a div here. Let's just push this back like that. Alright, so we have a div with the class of container that goes around everything. And then we have a header, which just has an H1. We have a section with the class of content. And inside here, there's an H3 and a paragraph. Then we have a side, which we want to be our sidebar. And then there's 3 boxes, and then a footer. So I just want to lay this out like a very simple website, where we have the header, the main content, the sidebar, the 3 boxes, and the footer. And we're going to do this just using the grid template areas property. So let's go up here, and actually let's save it and open it first. Everything is just going to be, you know, straight down. But we're going to set on the container, we want to set a grid. Okay, so we'll save that. Now here is where we want to put the grid template areas, right in the parent. So template dash areas, and we basically, like I said, we want to map this out visually. So the header, I want to go all the way across. So I'm going to do header, header, header. Now the reason I did it 3 times is because we're going to have 3 boxes that go all the way across. So you want to have the maximum number of columns you have to have in every row that you do. So that's our header row. We don't need a comma. The next one is going to be the content and the sidebar. So I want the content to take up 2 of the 3. And then the sidebar will take up just 1 here. Okay. The next one will be the boxes, which we have box 1. We need quotes. So box 1, box 2, and box 3. And then the footer I want to span all the way across, so we're just going to say footer 3 times. I don't know why I keep forgetting the quotes. Alright, now if I save this, it's gonna turn into a grid, but it's not doing what we want it to do because we haven't referenced these as grid areas. So what we need to do is take each element and assign it to one of these grid areas. So we have a header with the class of header, right? So I'm going to say class header, and I'm going to assign grid-area to header, okay, matching this right here. And if I save this, notice that now the header goes all the way across. And you might not be able to tell. I'm actually going to just paste this in real quick, which is just going to add a border around everything so you can see the actual outline of it. Let's actually add a grid gap as well. Okay, you can use all this stuff. Even though we're using grid template areas, it still works like a grid. So let's say grid gap 1 rem and save. Oops, what did I do here? I forgot my semicolon. Okay, so as you can see, the header spans across all 3. Now the section, the content area, I want to span 2 and then have the sidebar right here. So we have that set in the template areas, but we haven't assigned the grid areas yet. So let's take the content and let's assign the grid area to content. And then we'll assign the sidebar class to the grid area of sidebar. And if I save that, you can see that the content takes up 2 of them, 2, and then the sidebar takes up 1. And the heading is pretty much in place, but we have to add that as well. So we're going to take I'm sorry, not the heading, the boxes. They say heading inside. That's what confused me. But let's take box 1 and let's assign grid area to box 1, which pertains to this right here. And then I'm just going to copy this down because we want to do the same with 2 and 3. Okay. Save that, no change. But in the last one here, the footer, we want to go all the way across, which we specified right here that it's going to, but we need to assign the grid area. So it has a class of footer, and then we can simply say grid area footer and save. Okay, and that goes all the way across. Let's actually align that to the center as well. So text, align, center, and we'll do the same with the header. Very, very ugly, but I'm just showing you how you can use these grid template areas to literally map out what your layout should look like. Now, let's say we wanted to change this. Let's say we wanted to do, let's actually change, let's have box 3 have its own entire row. So I'm going to say this is going to be part of box 2, and then we'll go down and we'll say box 3, box 3, and box 3. So try to visualize what that's going to look like. So I'm going to save, and what happened is box 1 takes up 1, box 2 takes up 2, you can see it's longer, and then box 3 takes up basically its whole area here, just like the header and the footer does. Okay, so you can kind of experiment with this a little, but it's just so easy to create layouts now, okay, as opposed to having to float everything and clear them and so on. Now in the next video I'm going to show you how to utilize media queries to make your grids responsive. Alright guys, so now we're going to take a look at media queries with the grid. So let's create a file called 06 underscore grid underscore media queries .html. And we'll put our style tags. So I'm going to create the markup first. So we're going to have a container of grid, and then let's do an item and an H3 inside here. We'll just say heading, and then a paragraph with the text. We'll just do lorem 15, and then I'm going to copy this down. I want 4 of them, so I'm going to do 3 more. Alright, and we'll go ahead and save this and open it with Live Server. Okay, so let's start off with adding a grid. So we'll take the parent element and we'll set it to display grid. And let's say grid dash template columns, and we're going to do a repeat. Let's say repeat for auto. Okay, so that's going to set them to, it's basically a 4-column grid, and we'll do a grid gap of 1 rem. All right, now the way that this is naturally is it's just going to, it's 4 columns no matter what, okay, no matter how small. And what I would like to do is have it so that when we get to a certain point, like maybe tablet size 768 or so, we change it to 2 columns, and then when we get to mobile, it's stacked, meaning that it's just 1 column. So this is pretty easy to do. We can just add in a media query. So let's say we want this to be for max width 768 pixels. Oops, I don't need that. And then we're going to simply take our grid element, and we're going to say we want grid, actually I'll just copy this here, and let's say for max width 768 we want 2, so we'll say repeat 2 auto. Now once I hit 768, you can see that it goes to 2. Alright, and then we'll just add another one. So I'll copy this and we'll say at 500, so basically smartphones, I simply want 1 FR. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? Instead of auto, I'm just going to do 1 FR, like that. So we get the same result on big screens, and then basically tablet size, and then when we get to smartphone size, it stacks. So it's as easy as that to use media queries with the grid. Now, we also have grid template areas, which we went over in the last video, so I want to show you what we would do in that case. So I'm actually going to open up the file from the last video and just add to that. So let's go ahead and open this with Live Server. So right now, even if we go down, to mobile size, that doesn't look very good. So all we would have to do is add a media query. So we'll say at media, and I'm just going to do, let's see what this looks like at like 768. So it's okay, that's fine for like a tablet size, but for smartphones we want to change it. So let's do a max width of, let's say 500 pixels. And what we would do is just change up the grid template areas. So we'll take this, and if we want to stack everything, we can simply have 1 column. So we'll do header, content. Whoops, I forgot to put the selector, which is going to be our container of grid. Or is it? Wait, no, it's container. Sorry. So container, and then I'm going to paste that in, and we'll say header. So we only want 1. We want these to be stacked. So header, content. And then we'll add in here sidebar. We'll do box 1, box 2, box 3, and footer. Okay, so it's only 1 column. And again, this is visually representative of what we actually want to display in our browser. So let's save, and now everything is nicely stacked. Okay, so when it hits 500 pixels, everything stacks nicely. So pretty easy. We're going to be getting more into this in our project, which we're going to get into in the next section.